From the Broad Institute in Cambridge, this is the Pulse podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Vicki.
I'm your other co-host, Fangxie.
Together, we dive deep into biotech stories and feature biotech leaders. This podcast is brought to you by the GSAS Harvard Biotech Club, a trainee-led Harvard biotech organization, which is on a mission to bridge the gap between academia and industry.
Today, we get to talk to someone who has pretty much seen and shaped every era of modern biotech industry. Dr. Vicki Sato started her career as a scientist in the lab of Dr. Paul Levine studying photosynthesis, but then made a jump in her postdoc work when she joined Stanford. Initially, she returned to Harvard as a professor in the Department of the Cell and Developmental Biology. She then made a bold leap to the industry at a time when the move was far from typical, joining the Biogen in the mid-1980s and later becoming Chief Scientific Officer and then President of Vertex Pharmaceuticals. At Vertex, helped drive some of the company's most transformative scientific bets, including work on HIV protease inhibitors, hepatitis C, and a groundbreaking cystic fibrosis drug program that ultimately changed the trajectory of disease many thought was untreatable.
After decades leading at the highest levels of biotech, Vicki came back to Harvard to teach courses on drug discovery and the commercialization of science, and to help launch the Blavatnik Fellowship in Life Science Entrepreneurship, an initiative that has already mentored dozens of scientist founders and helped spin out ventures that have raised hundreds of millions in funding. Beyond academia, she continues to shape the future of the industry through board and advisory roles, including at Biotechnology, Denali Therapeutics, Allogene Therapeutics, and as a venture partner at Arch Venture Partners. Vicki was also a member of the President's Council of Advisors for Science and Technology for President Biden. With a career that spans scientist, executive, teacher, mentor, and advisor, Vicki Sato has had one of the most wide-ranging and influential journeys in biotechnology, and we're genuinely excited that we get to hear her story today.
Welcome to the show, Vicki.
I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, I'm excited you're able to make it in person for this interview. So we always like to start these interviews hearing more about people's origins, how they got into science. Could you tell us a bit about your upbringing and what led you to become interested in science early in your life?
So I grew up in Chicago, in the inner city of Chicago, back in the post-Sputnik years, when science education was really undergoing a fantastic metamorphosis, really driven by federal support. And I often cite it as an example of the impact that a well-considered federal program to upgrade educational agendas and educational curricula can really have an impact. So it was a time when, because everyone was worried that Russia was going to get the leap on us and send more satellites down to spy on us, there was a real effort to make science exciting and more empirically based. And I was a lucky kind of public school product of that educational shift. And I think that helped inspire me to think about science. They were the most interesting and maybe challenging classes that I was taking. I loved English. I loved, history, but there was something about science that really piqued my interest. And then, like many Asian families, the push to go to medical school was pretty clear, because it was a place where you could always have a job and be respected in the community. So I think the combination of the familial culture and the educational benefit converged.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I feel like being a doctor is a very tangible thing, because I'm sure you're interested in science, but it's like we don't really think about what research is and what being a scientist is, because that's not as widely seen. There's no TV shows about scientists compared to like being a doctor.
There were lots of doctor shows, Dr. Kildare, Ben Casey. I mean, it was a very tangible application of science, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, so you're interested in science and grew up in Chicago, and then you did your undergraduate at Radcliffe and Harvard. So kind of what got you into doing biology, and then you got into doing research as well while you were here as an undergrad?
I came with the intent of studying science. I really didn't know much about the Ivy League. It's not, my adolescent ambition was really to get into the 6-year pre-med medical school program at Northwestern. I just thought that would be so cool. Mm. And then, I don't know, life takes funny turns, and I ended up at Radcliffe/Harvard. But it was a very different cultural experience. Mm-hmm. But my interest in science was still there. And so I just with the enthusiasm of a new recruit, thought I'll study science. This is great. Not realizing that people like Eric Lander, who were Westinghouse scholars, we weren't contemporaries. I'm older than his, but the science classes are filled with fundamentally geniuses, and so it was like, whoa, this is this is really interesting and really hard, but I kept at it.
Yeah, it's always like a difference moving somewhere new too, especially it's like being in a new space and then also adjusting to science, how it's taught in college compared to like high school.
Yeah, it was very different. And it was also a time, just again, revealing how long I've been around at this, but the introductory biology course, Jim Watson would give lectures in it. Keith Porter, who was, one of the early inventors and conceptualizers of electron microscopy, was teaching the cell biology class. Matt Messelson was teaching genetics. So these were the heroes of the most exciting science that was unraveling, molecular biology. And to sit in lecture halls listening to people of that stature and of that kind of intellect and drive, even as they were doing the science that was changing how we view the world, that was an amazing experience.
Yeah, it's like a formative time for molecular biology, but also a formative time as like a student to learn. And you even decided to stay here for your graduate school as well. And then for that, I know a lot of people are surprised because as someone in biotech, they don't think usually people go into like human molecular biology early, but you study plant biology as a graduate student.
I actually was really interested in genetics. And I was interested in genetics because taking Matt Messelson's genetics course was one of those inspirational moments. I think you probably had that experience as well. There's some class that you take, some scientist that you meet who suddenly makes you think differently about problems that have been around you for a while. And Matt's genetics course was like that. So I wanted to do genetics. So I was studying photosynthesis, but I was using the genetics of a unicellular organism called Clavidomonas to really study the genetics of electron transport. So I viewed it less about plants and I viewed it as a lot about genetics. But then in the end, you're working with plants, so you sort of get caught up in the underlying science of plants, which is the ability to convert light energy into chemical energy.
Yeah, it's a very fundamental thing. A lot of us don't even think about that,
Right.
Especially being focused on humans. And you did like a very different research shift too, going from grad school and postdoc, because then you shifted to do more immunology research.
Right. So even as I was doing the theme here was that I was doing the genetics of plants, and then a faculty member came to Harvard, Tom Wegman, who was one of the first people to do tetraparental mice. And he was an immunologist studying immunology. I'd never even, I didn't know anything about immunology, but I sat in on his seminar class and I thought, oh, this is really pretty interesting. And I like the framing I still love the framing of immunology. It's about self and non-self and sort of philosophical as well as scientific. And Tom was an incredibly enthusiastic and kind of in-capturing sort of scientist. So I thought, plants are cool, but, and maybe it was the holdover from medical school, but at some point I'd like to maybe switch back into animal systems or switch to animal systems. So my first postdoc, which was at Berkeley, continued to be in photosynthesis. I actually decided to dig deeper into photosynthesis and work much more on the biophysical end of light capture. But then I thought, it just, first of all, I wanted to get back to problems that were more medically relevant. And did my second postdoc at Stanford with Len Herzenberg, who was developing the fluorescence activated cell sort, which is a mainstay in the laboratories that you all take for granted. But when I was in Len's lab, there was one cell sorter. It occupied a room a little bit smaller than this. It required 2 people to operate full time, and it enabled unbelievable experiments.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, that's a big leap from the plant to the human. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, the biggest leap is, when you're working on plants, and I worked on spinach, and I worked on Clavidomonas. So Clavidomonas, you grow like bacteria in big light flasks and light rooms, and spinach, you just buy at the grocery store and grind it up. So sample prep was sterile, right? Sample prep in immunology means you have to take mice and do things to them. And so I think my first day in the lab, one of the grad students took me upstairs to the animal room and said, okay, well, you have to kill these mice and take out their spleens. I went, got it. Okay. So sample prep became quite a different.
Yeah, it's a little easier to do it with like plants rather than mice.
Throwing spinach in a wearing blender is a familiar activity.
Yeah.
We all, you probably do that at home. Figuring out the best and most humane way to deal with small furry animals was a different challenge.
It's like an adjustment. So you did like the traditional kind of academic path at that point, and then after doing those two postdocs, you had to make the decision between going to academia and industry, and your first job was being a professor back at Harvard. So what was that thought process like to decide to do that?
It was motivated by a couple of different things. First of all, in those days, 2 postdocs was a lot of postdocs. A lot of people just did 1 postdoc, for a couple of years, and then you look for an academic job. There wasn't industry to speak of as a career, but so I had already done 2 postdocs, so it was like time to get a real job. So a real job was a job in academia. So I was looking for opportunities, and that was the science part. And the other part was I'd spent 4 years in the Bay Area, and I went there like many people do. It was an intellectual mecca that was really wonderful, but I didn't like living on the West Coast. And I decided that I was an East Coast neurotic, not a West Coast neurotic. And so I started looking for jobs on the...
You moved from East Coast a few times.
I started in the middle, and then I went East, and then I went West. And then I just felt more comfortable on the East Coast, especially in Boston. I like Boston. So there was a job available, and I threw my hat in, and I earned it.
In some past interviews, you have also said that the time you thought it would be your biggest mistake after your big leap to the industry. What pulled you toward the industry?
That's a change that really evolved over the almost 10 years that I was on the faculty at Harvard for the first time, because there was no industry. So back in 1975, when I came back to be an assistant professor, there was no, you could go work. I didn't even know this, right? There were jobs in pharmaceutical companies where you could do assay work or pharmacology or whatever, but that wasn't anything that someone who had trained in the academic path that I had no awareness of that. So it was, you go do your postdoc, you get a junior faculty position, you work really hard, and you try to get tenure, and then you just have tenure, and that's what you do. You run your lab. So I came to Harvard with the expectation that that's what I would try very hard to climb the ladder. And people did say to me, don't go there. First of all, there was one woman in the department. Who was tenured. So the tenure track at Harvard had a low hit rate. So it was like, you're not going to get tenure. You wouldn't get tenure no matter what your gender was, but your gender certainly not going to work in your favor. And nobody's going to talk to you. The senior faculty doesn't treat the junior faculty very well, and you won't get any students, and it'll just be hell on earth. Don't do it. It's a big mistake. But I did it. Parts of that were true. The tenure track at Harvard back then, as is now, is not an easy thing to achieve. But the rest of it wasn't. The senior faculty, I really met some amazing, senior scientists who were incredibly supportive of helping me from nothing. I had no idea what, it was my first R01 grant. I had terrific grad students, and a big surprise was how good the undergraduates were, because as a young assistant professor doing a science, immunology, which was not a science that was deeply represented in the biology department at the time. It was very molecularly driven, but I had most of the animals in the animal facility. But I was surprised that undergraduates and first-year graduate students were curious about this area of science, which is really starting to blossom, which is what attracted me to it as well. So I was able to get a lab established and had a really great time. I had a great time being a junior faculty at Harvard, even though people told me it was going to be hell on earth. It wasn't. It was like great colleagues, and it was just a great experience. So I was there for a long time. I was there for 8+ years.
Oh, wow.
And then, Fung, to your point, and I was, then I was going to start to look for tenure jobs.
Wow.
But then biotech started to happen. So it was only against that background of being a pretty classical academic scientist that I had the opportunity to think about branching off.
Yeah, you mentioned like industry wasn't really as seen as like a kind of as viable path as it now, because like Kendall Square, where we are now, wasn't as big then.
Kendall Square was a wasteland.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing, and then there was Lechmere Sales, which there's now a station there, but it was a wholesale place. And it was also a time when the important molecular biologists at Harvard and at MIT were defending the right to do recombinant DNA research at the city council.
Oh, wow.
So there was a lot of pushback around the safety of doing recombinant DNA research, the public responsibility. And so if you go into the archives, you'll see grainy videos of meetings where scientists like Mark Batashny, Wally Gilbert were trying to convince the mayor and the councilors of Cambridge that this was a safe thing to do.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's like all things we take for granted now, since Cambridge is so like supportive of the biotech kind of environment here now.
And it was because of, that generation of scientists really laid the groundwork for educating that was scared. I'd say curious, but legitimately scared, releasing organisms. And there were other very important and knowledgeable scientists who were very concerned about the safety of the science and feeling that policing oneself wasn't the best way to develop regulation. So there was a legitimate and prolonged debate across the scientific community about how and if to enable this kind of science.
So there's like these conditions affecting biotech, and you just started your lab at Harvard, and then you had the opportunity to like join Biogen at the start. So how did that opportunity present itself?
It was. I wish it had been at the start. I feel like I was a bystander at the start. So this Biogen was started by, as you know, Phil Sharp, and I know Phil has recently given a talk about the history of biotech and the history of Kendall Square. So you probably got the picture of this. But there was Genentech, which had started with Cohen Boyer really in California, and Biogen started with Phil Sharp was an important founder. Wally Gilbert was too. But the idea was that Biogen would be East Coast and European. So the founders of the company included Charles Weissman, Ken Murray, important scientists who were pioneers in recombinant DNA work back in the day, and they were going to build a company, a biotech company that was centered in Geneva. So the first offices and labs for Biogen were in Geneva, and they were working on alpha interferon, working on cloning hepatitis B surface antigen for vaccines. And I got to know about it because Wally and I were teaching immunology together. And teaching with Wally was an amazing experience. It was one of the most intellectually stimulating experiences of my career. And he and I shared the lectures, and we graded papers together, and we would hang out with the students together. And it was just great. The first couple of years were incredible. And I think it was the third year, Wally started from time to time calling me on the weekend and saying, "Hey, can you give the lecture on Monday or Tuesday or whatever?" Because I'm in England raising $30 million from some venture capital group, and going, what is this? And but because of that, he and I he started telling me about what Biogen was about, and I had no interest in being part of it, but I was really fascinated by what it took to do this. It involves things that I don't know, what's a venture capitalist? What's a stock option? What's intellectual property? Why does anybody care? And so I just got curious about the fact that this thing was happening. And Mark Batashny and Tom Maniatis were building Genetics Institute in West Cambridge. And there was just a lot of excitement by scientists who I really respected. This wasn't a third tier kind of activity for scientists. It was really being led by the leaders of academic science. So I just got curious about it.
That's very cool. So yeah, it's very exciting coming from the academic world. And then I guess you were there at the start. So what was that like to really create like a biotech from the startup, especially when this ecosystem wasn't as big as it was then?
Well, Biogen was started in Geneva, and they were doing their thing. I got involved. I took a sabbatical year, my last year as an associate professor at Harvard, and I worked on a diagnostic startup using monoclonal antibodies with two faculty members from MIT. And that was my first. I was very much the tag-along junior person. These guys were famous. And But when you're the tag along junior person, you get to do some of the, you do the bad stuff. It was fun. We found a building, found space, made a laboratory, hired the first few people, had to come up with a business plan. And, I was there as sort of a backup in terms of money raising. They were really interested in funding, more established scientists. But it gave me a taste of what it took to start a company literally from nothing, right? It's you, a couple of cardboard boxes and a phone, and as we had them in those days, Xerox machines. But that, just the task of doing that was much more interesting than I thought it was going to be. And I guess at the same time, I think we all make career decisions based on pushes and pulls. I was also asking myself, okay, I've been doing academic science now for some time. And how is my life as an academic scientist going to change over the next 35 whatever years? And I thought, I like science for that moment when you get to understand something about the world that nobody else understands, and it's a problem you've been beating your head against the wall for, and you go, I think I can make this work. So I really like that. But on the other hand, I kept thinking, do I like this enough to do it over and over again for the next 35, 40 years, whatever. And I didn't have a good answer to that because I'd never thought about doing anything else. So I took the sabbatical and started getting involved with this startup. And I thought, I think I want to give this a shot. So I did. I kind of thought, if I did this, I wasn't crazy about it. I mean, I wasn't irresponsible. I don't think I was irresponsible about it. I was willing to take the risk, but I also said, look, if I do this, I could be toast on the academic job market. I could be terrible at it, or not. And you don't know until you're going to do it. So the push was kind of, I wanted to look to see what else I could do with my scientific training besides be an academic. Not because I liked being an academic, but I didn't know whether I liked it 35 years worth. Who knew? So I just decided I'd do this, and then I would give myself a couple of years to find out if I did like it, to find out if I was any good at it. And that if I decided to come back, I'd probably have to, backpedal the academic ladder climbing a bit, take a lateral position someplace, start a lab up again from scratch. But I was willing to take the risk. And it turned out to be the right decision for me to go into industry.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. And sure, it's risky now, but you've had this career in industry because you started at Biogen. And then at some point you were working there, leading research there, but then you had the opportunity to work at Vertex, which was also starting around that time. So what was that like to also make another big decision like that?
I loved working at Biogen. I would say Biogen is where, startup notwithstanding, Biogen was the place where I really started to learn in earnest about what it takes to do science and pharmaceutical drug discovery kind of science in a pretty well-funded environment, where there was infrastructure. And I learned a lot about how science is the same and how science is different in an industrial setting, how this notion of working in teams, this idea of having clear product-defined goals as opposed to knowledge-defined goals. And I liked the whole thing. I loved hanging out with people who were scientists very different from me. I mean, I was like I got hired to start an immunology group. So it's not like there were a lot of molecular biologists who were excellent. Got to hang out with people who did very different kinds of science. Well, engineers, I'd never met one before, and it was fascinating. And then I got to hang out with lawyers and marketing people, and it was just this broadly interdisciplinary experience, and the clarity of why you were doing the work that you were doing. It's not clarity, but it's the immediacy of it was just something that hooked me because, like I'm sure you do this too. I was writing NIH grants and I'm an immunologist. So I would write something like, and I'm studying not the evolution, but I'm studying the maturation of the immune system. So I'm writing things like, someday this sort of, work could have an impact on diseases like arthritis or diabetes or whatever, but it's very theoretical. And here in this setting, you're actually doing science that tomorrow could go into the first humans to ever try this molecule. I mean, that's just the immediacy of it, the tangibility of it, and all the different kinds of expertise that had to come together to make that moment happen. And then even thinking about, okay, this molecule has never been in a human being before. Who, what's our responsibility as scientists to ensure that this is a risk that somebody should take?
Yeah.
And how do you think about the people who raise their hand and say, I'll do it? Because that still affects me deeply. The first people in clinical trials were the first people to try a new therapy, a new drug, a new modality. And just how much we owe those people and how much as scientists we owe them with regard to the precision of the science that we do. So, I used to think, man, getting the cover of Nature, that's like really hard science. But the level of hard and the kind of reliability as scientists we have to be responsible for to put a new molecule or a new set of cells or whatever into the first human being, that's a whole different level of responsibility. Yeah. And I learned about that. I learned about that at Biogen. I learned about the responsibility of a scientist in the private sector. I learned about how you keep a company going. You're not writing grants. You have to go ask investors for money to fund the work. And that was a little more thrilling than I expected it to be. I remember the first time going on Wall Street to raise a round of capital for Biogen, thinking, I used to lecture in corduroys and clogs, and now I'm in a suit and high heels going, what am I doing here? But it was, I don't know, it was very exciting. And it's not often that you get to be part of a new industry starting. So here in Kendall Square, we take it all for granted. But back then, Biogen was the only company on the block, one of a handful of companies in the world, and you're making it up as you go along in the most respectful sense. How are we going to raise it? Where's the next round of money going to come from? What do we have to do to deserve it or to get it or compete for it effectively? Where do we find the scientists who are going to do the work? Because you convince them to take a chance and come and work in an industrial setting when they're all trying to be professors at Harvard or MIT or whatever. It just was all new. It was all new and really exciting.
Feel lonely sometimes because around you is never no ecosystem.
I never felt lonely because I was always working with teams of people in the company who they were family, right? Just because you're trying to do this crazy thing. And some of the friendships and the collegial relationships I built back up at Biogen are still, it was just a really shared experience. And also, so I didn't feel lonely. I often felt like this is an insurmountable problem and how are we going to solve this? And can we solve it in time? Because the temporal urgency is something else that you can get a little relaxed about in academia. Yes, you have to get enough data to write the competitive renewal or your progress report or whatever. But so it slips here a little, but the importance of meeting deadlines so that you can raise the next round of money, the importance of meeting deadlines so you can actually get the medicine into the clinic to try it or to enroll enough patients. It was in the world.
Yeah.
And in a different kind of way. And I'm a big fan of academic science, and I'm a big fan of basic science because it's basic science that made this industry possible. But back in those days, there were no templates for what to do. You and the people around you creating medicines and creating a business at the same time. So it was a good example of
the trailblazer. Right?
It's the building the plane while you're trying to fly it sort of thing. So it was super exciting. I was lucky. I was it was an accident of time.
Yeah, it's very challenging, but the excitement and the fact that there's these large groups of people, like you said, working on it, where it's like everyone's like equally passionate to make it happen, just because it's very much you're working on a small timeline of like we need to get this done.
Right.
And it felt like you were trying to do the impossible and just mentioned like HIV in the beginning. Cystic fibrosis, I know there's a small group of people, very energetic, but what helped you and your team overcome the challenges? So there's a lot of things, I think, for you guys. You mentioned the Biogen starting up team, very academic, right?
Well, you couldn't recruit people who had done it before because it hadn't been done before. Right? So the scientists, we all came from academia, and we needed to learn how to work together to make a product and what a product meant. And so there were the inevitable tensions between different kinds of scientists and different scientists and business people, and all of that stuff. Wally Gilbert gave me a book back when I joined, right when I joined Biogen. Actually, then I'll tell you another story, and maybe I hadn't thought about this before, but when I got to Biogen, Wally gave me a book that was called Games Mother Never Taught You. And he said, women and scientists need to read this book. So, and it was a book that was written by Simmons, which had one of the first management track degree granting schools for women interested in business and management. And so that's what was called Games Mother Never Taught You. And it was about how to survive in a male dominated business environment. But it was in that book that I first understood that the business person's perception of R&D is that R&D is a cost center, not a revenue generator. So the goal is to just keep it as small as possible. and that, of course, becomes a tension in strategic planning. And I was never a part of a company that was like irrationally so, but it just sort of set a framework for me in terms of how do you think about a highly risky science becoming the foundation for a business, right? This isn't, I can make 1,000 of these. Let me show you, or, let me show you my app. I've beta tested it with, 5,000 people. This is, who knows? Maybe we can make the medicine. Maybe we can't. So that was that. And then when I went to Vertex, I realized, it started with a book too, because when I signed my letter of acceptance to go there as the CSO, Josh sent me the galley proofs of the $1 billion molecule book that was written. And he said, you read this now because all these people in this book, they're going to report to you.
Oh, yeah.
So I hadn't thought about the parallels, but in both cases, the books provided a little preview on what was coming.
Yeah, it's a good point. You got to see the preview, and I read the book too, and it's like you were featured towards like the end, I guess. So even though you got the preview of it, you were end up being in there as well.
Well, like I was in the second edition or whatever because I wasn't there for the initial book. I still think, I don't know, what did you think of that book?
Because I guess I got a lot more that, like with pharma and science, there's a lot more politics and behind the scenes. Because I think when you just hear like, oh, this company makes this, you're like, oh, everyone is supportive. But it's interesting seeing these like back and forths, especially a lot of the discussion with Vertex and Harvard. Because I think being in this ecosystem, you just, you take it for granted that there's all these behind the scenes, and I don't know, you kind of overlook it. But it was interesting. I don't know if you thought it was as accurate.
Now, I still think that it's one of the best books that captures what the joys and the agonies of starting a company in biotech. I think it's still one of the best books that captures that. There are many excellent books written about novel technologies. There are books written about single product stories, but Barry Worth is just an excellent writer, and he had carte blanche on the companies, and he spent a lot of time with the people that he wrote about. And so I think there's something about, he captures something of the madness and the improbability of trying to build a company from an idea. Right? And how do you do that? And that's one of the things I really learned at Vertex and from Josh Boger and his team. Just how do you do that? And the importance of every single person you hire, and the importance of the clarity of the mission, and the importance of the bigness of the vision. At Harvard Business School is known for saying you have to start with a big, hairy, audacious goal if you want to get people inspired, which always sounds like sort of a businessy school thing. But Josh embodied that. He had a very clear vision of what he wanted to do. It was improbable, highly improbable. And he knew what he had to do. And he had a pretty damn good idea of what he was going to have to do to make it happen. And had a very high tolerance for risk and uncertainty.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I feel like these early biotechs, they kind of have like immediacy of like starting an academic lab where it's like everyone that's working in there has to be fully invested, but then the larger stakes of like you're developing a drug to treat patients. It's a very interesting hybrid kind of experience. And then, so you're getting the early days of Vertex, and I think towards the end of like you being like VP and CSO there, there's a lot of work with hepatitis C, but then it was like the start of like the cystic fibrosis program as well. So what was that like being like kind of on the ground floor of getting that started as you were working there?
We got involved with the cystic fibrosis program when Vertex bought a company called Aurora Biosciences, which was actually an assay development and big high throughput screening company in San Diego. And Josh and I took a lot of shit for doing that acquisition actually at the time, but we were excited about the complementarity of the science and the technologies that the two companies embodied. So Aurora had a contract with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation to develop a new set of assays that would be helpful to mostly academic investigators because pharma wasn't interested in cystic fibrosis, but to develop new sets of assays that could be helpful mostly to academic scientists who were looking for better ways to treat this really difficult disease. And they had built a very, actually quite exciting business around this model of working with nonprofit disease foundations to provide them with primarily novel assays that would allow other investigators to use these assays to test their ideas or to develop modalities or to test drugs or whatever. They were not in the business of making medicines. They were in the business of providing assays at scale. And I'm a big believer in the importance of assays. You know, you get what you assay for it. So if you have the wrong assay, you're going to...
Yeah.
And so there were relationships with other disease foundations, but the relationship with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation was an important one, and the team at Aurora was doing some really remarkable work on assay development, coupled with automation. And in the long course of making these amazing drugs, this was really just the beginning, and so my contributions were modest and early. But I do remember very clearly when we were there sort of reviewing the science progress, and the team there had figured out a way to clone primary bronchial epithelial cells from normal and sick patients. And you could see the mucus that gets secreted. And so the cilia can't beat, just as a measure of the situation of too viscous. And they developed a visualization and measurement technology that allowed you to flow, in principle, compounds over this, and you could watch these stuck cilia suddenly become alive if you had something that would disrupt.
Dynamics, something like that. Yeah.
And it was kind of breathtaking and a really long way from a drug, right? Just a really long way from a drug. And so there was a lot of debate about, should we do this? Should we not do it? It's an orphan disease. Can we make any money doing this? Is this the best use of our skills? Whatever. It's not a structure-based drug design problem. Right? This is not a problem where the target we could all look at the atomic level. This is a target where we're looking at phenotypic physiologic responses, for better or for worse. But Aurora's great strength and the team there was the ability to do that. Let's take a bet. It was really very scientifically driven. Well, let's see, here's an assay. What would be the things you could measure in a clinical study? Do we have the guts to take on a chemistry program where we're trying to deal with some not very clear biology? Do we want to put more channel into the membrane? Do we want to activate the channels that are there? There's a diversity of mutations. Can we do this? How hard a chemistry problem is this going to be? And, my hat is off to the many people who from that time really made it happen, made different molecules, revealed different modalities for action. And I'm so proud of the scientists there they just won the Lasker Prize. They won the Breakthrough Prize. It's not often that scientists in the private sector get recognized at that level, and they so deserve it. But I think we were driven, as Vertex often is, by the sheer difficulty of the problem scientifically, right? So we were all kind of hooked on, it's got to be hard. Because if it's hard, other people won't have solved it. And it's got to matter. And if you could really make a drug that did that, that got at the heart of what we understood cystic fibrosis to be about, it would be a game changer. Because mostly what cystic fibrosis patients experienced was physical disruption of mucus, better antibiotics to clear out lung infections. The most interesting drug was one developed by Genzyme, Pulmozyme, which was a DNase to go and, kind of loosen up the mucus. So that was it. Vertex has always been about that. Hard science, but the solution would make a real difference. It was exciting. Improbable. Hepatitis C was equally improbable. I mean, that was a project that was a classic Vertex project. Structure-based, hard. How do you design a molecule to fit on a dinner plate as opposed to in a little teacup? But the team did it. And, the drug worked and was the fastest drug to $1 billion in sales in
Amazing.
the history of the pharma industry. And then there were some always important, some business issues that needed to be addressed that were quite addressed as well.
Yeah. How many years had you led the Vertex Pharmaceuticals?
I was at Vertex from 92 till 2005. So 14, it was close to 14 years.
Oh, wow.
14 years.
That's Vertex, initially a startup and then becoming a large company. You now have a lot of pipeline and a lot of things. 2022, you got a Sato medal, and the Nitin Noria have a quote. I will read it. Vicki is not just a great scientist. She also has a business judgment to know how to prioritize scientific projects. How do you learn that skills? Our question first. And so what's your internal process of deciding when to double down versus when to pivot away from project that once you believe in? That's different level and the layer. So we want to hear about that.
I don't have a magic formula. And I think R&D leaders and company leaders all have their internal compasses or internal frameworks for making decisions. And as I just said in describing the cystic fibrosis project, the things that are important to me are that it's going to take a long time and it's going to cost a lot of money. So it's got to be something that's going to make a difference. But we never wanted to be the fifth company to make a statin. Maybe the fifth company, as is true, that the fifth company makes the most money making that statin because they figured out how to address the market with the product. But for me, it was always about the game had to be worth the candle, that if you made this medicine, which was going to take a lot of brain power and a lot of time and a lot of money, that you could imagine that this kind of therapy would be different and it would change how therapy happened. So that was true of adding protease inhibitors to the HIV cocktails, right? Mortality didn't really change with the nucleotide inhibitors. It really took the protease inhibitors being in the cocktail. So impact is important. On the other side of that, though, is you constantly have to ask yourself, if you take too long, or you get off the track, or you decide that this problem is going to take an irrelevantly long time, like by the time you solve it, the world will have moved on, kind of thing. So understanding that you still have a leadership position in the marketplace or in terms of medical impact is the other side of this. It can't just be about how great the science is. It has to be, is the need still as you thought it would be? And can you justify and support an argument that says that the economic return will reflect that contribution? Because if it doesn't, then go do your science. That's an academic project. If you want to do science in a company, the problem can be hard. I'm all for hard problems, but you have to keep being honest with yourself that the value of what you're creating is still great. And if somebody beat you to the punch or whatever, and that titrates down the value of what you're doing, you have to stop and rethink it. That is just really important. One of the tougher decisions that companies have to make and company leaders have to make is exactly this. It's the issue of what's the resource allocation? Where do you put the money? When do you double down on it? When do you decide you need to cut it off? Maybe you come back to it later, but it's, so where do you put the money? And no matter how much you like a project, I think, and how much you think it's justified. If you don't have the leadership, the scientists, the business people who are really committed and willing to like leap tall buildings because their conviction is high and they can support it with data and their work, it's not going to work either, right? So you can have the best idea on the planet, but I think if you can't pick some people out of the corps de ballet and say, right, I'm going to take a chance, time for you to dance Swan Lake, can you do it? You won't make the product either. So for me, it's always this, what's the impact? Who can do it?
Okay, so this early experience with Biogen and Vertex at the beginning as well. I know there's like a lot of achievements and challenges. So would you want to share a little bit about kind of your favorite achievements and some of the challenges that you guys had to overcome to get to those points?
There are always challenges. I think in terms of exciting and rewarding moments, I still remember with great clarity when Vertex's HIV protease inhibitor got approved by the FDA. And the call came from the FDA after business hours. I think I was at a Pilates class or something. And just because it was so tense. And there was something so just emotional and exciting about getting that approval because the team had worked really hard. We were working with a pharma company, which presented its own opportunities and challenges. But it was when you get that approval and you know that the medicine is going to be available, and especially for HIV, because we worked a lot with patient advocates. And in those days, AIDS patients were among the most educated, self-educated, thoughtful, invested for their lives. And we worked a lot with the community, not just for patient advocacy, which was important, but also to help us understand what are the drugs like? What is it like to take these things? What would make a difference for you? What's the shape of a drug that would make a difference for you? And so for me, it was very personal. It was a very personal effort in HIV. And so that was just to know that we were going to contribute to a medicine for a group of people who were otherwise guaranteed to be dead in 12 to 18 months was pretty remote. That's high and lows. But I think every medicine that one works on, I was on the board of a company that was started by a Blavatnik fellow. The company was called Akuos, and it's a company that was developing gene therapy to restore hearing to people with congenital hearing loss. Now that's hard and improbable, but when we got the first data that a patient who had been deaf for 11 years was able to hear, was that excitement, that gratification, it never gets old for me. I just, because it's hard. It's, as I said, it's hard. You've got to do really good science to get there. You have to do a lot of really good everything else that's not science to get there. And when you actually see it making a difference for a patient, I know it sounds schmaltzy, but it kind of is what it's all about.
Yeah, you get good results preclinically, but it's like until it actually affects patients positively.
Those are just a couple of examples. So there's that's purpose-driven gratification, if you will. And then along the way, they're all, first of all, you have to celebrate all the victories along the way, because this is, making a drug is a 10-year project, plus or minus a few years. But also you're trying to build, in biotech, you're also trying to build a company. So there's also the gratification that comes from going, yes, we had a strategy. We're executing well on the strategy. We can go raise another round of money, fight another day, or we've communicated our story well, or we haven't, and we're in trouble. So we all have to pull together to really work through a tough time. That could mean layoffs. That could mean, lots of different things. And just the ability to pull people together successfully to work through the tough times is another really important moment. There was a time when Biogen stock was at 2. People forget this. And we were in a CEO transition. We brought in a new CEO. It was a huge culture shock. And we had some hard things to do, but you pull people together, which is a skill that as a scientist, I never really appreciated. And I had to learn those skills. And I had a boss at Biogen who stuck my nose in it and saying, if you're gonna amount to anything, you got to learn these skills, not just those skills. And so this, the ability to bring a strategy to life and get the people mobilized to do things with common purpose. Not in a blinded way. I mean, as you can tell from the $1 billion molecule, there's lots of great discussion and debate. But then making sure you get through the discussion, debate, you hear the points, and then you move to a decision and move forward. Those are also really important moments. Just getting through the, as the saying goes, especially these times that we're in right now, this has been a very, very difficult period for the biotech industry. I don't think in all the years I've been in it, the funding environment has been as difficult, especially coming off a very heady period. And because of the national stance on science right now as it feels, but also the competition from China, it's a time when it's very easy to be discouraged. And one doesn't want to be a Pollyanna about this at all. But I think now is not the time to back away. So, I feel leadership in the area has got to stand up for the industry, has got to stand up for American science, has to stand up for the value of innovation. And I don't want the younger generation of scientists and entrepreneurs to get discouraged by this environment. It's very easy to get discouraged. Everybody that I know is in a bad mood. I'm often in a bad mood. It's too important for us as a country. It's too important for us as just humans. We have problems to solve. We can't just kind of throw up our hands and say, it's ugly out there. So I worry about that, right? I worry that young people get discouraged and decide to go to law school or something. Lawyers are great, but, so I want scientists and really creative entrepreneurs on the business side to, now's the time for people who are determined, who are creative, fearless, sensible, to stay the course here and push us into the next phase.
It's a good point. Even when we're in a downturn, it's like we need science, the biomedical enterprise to continue, because it's always cyclical. So we're going to get to the next point where it'll be a better time for people to get into it.
The one you're in always feels like the worst.
Yeah.
but you gotta, it's not going to get better by itself. It's going to get better because some people push to make it better.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe it's before getting better, it's getting worse usually. So as a follow up the questions, what's your actionable suggestion for young generation who want to be entrepreneur or who want to continue working on biotech innovation?
I always start with spend time thinking about what problem it is you want to solve and why you want to solve it. Which is what you tell young scientists, and it's the same thing you tell young entrepreneurs. Building a company, tackling a challenging scientific or medical problem, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to require persistence and resilience. So make sure it's a problem that you want to solve, that you're willing to spend the next some number of years X on this problem, and that it's a problem worth solving. So sometimes people fall into this and then they sort of look around and go, why am I doing this? And so spending time really saying to yourself, why is this the problem what is the problem I want to solve? Why do I want to solve it? How much time and money or whatever is it going to take for me to have the tools available to solve it? And just that, because persistence happens because it doesn't just happen. It's there because you are driven to solve a problem because it's meaningful to you and hopefully meaningful to others as well. And so it's, people will say to me, well, what's your advice? I'm interviewing with this company, this company, this. Often it's like, well, those companies are doing really different things. So why are you interviewing at those companies? What is it that drew you to those companies particularly? And then it's, what's a problem you want to spend some time solving? Who are the people you want to solve them with? Because you're not going to solve these problems alone. If you're going to go lead a company, why is that the company you want to? What is that company going to do? What are you going to help that company do? How are you going to shape the future of that company? And why is that important to you? Self-inspection is an important first step for me. And then it's about, how do what do you need to make it happen? And pick the right people. Pick the right people. Then by right, I mean the people who together with you will make it have a higher opportunity for success. And that might be different for you and for you and for me, but just know who you are, know who will
Yeah.
help you build something that's, get to the end.
But do you encourage, the graduate students or trainees now from the lab and directly, or some people argue that because you definitely need more like experience and the mindset or skill sets, so probably step into the industry and get experience. That's make more sense. So what's your comments? Yeah,
And I'm not going to make you happy because I'm going to say, well, it kind of depends, right? So I'm also a believer in efficiency. So there are without a doubt first-time entrepreneurs on the business side and on the science side who make it happen, right? And I've worked with people like that. It's their first time being CEO, first time, bringing science into a company, and out of just talent, bloody-mindedness, whatever, it works. It's not always the most efficient way to go. So some of this has to do with, why do you think you can do it? Do you have any data to support that? Do you have any data to support that level of confidence? It's a lonely business. How do you handle being alone? How do you, do you like, do you need affirmation? Because if you need affirmation like 3 days a week, it's probably not a good place to go. The other component of this, though, is that in biotech or running a business, learning from people who've done it is a very important and efficient way to learn. So some people say, oh, don't work for a big pharma company. You'll be brain dead. I look at that a little bit differently. I say, where can you go and work where you can learn what you need to learn for this next phase efficiently? Work for people who've done it. Work for people who are generous with their time and experience and who'll share what they've learned. So that's an efficient way to learn. We can all learn by the seat of our pants, but it's not always the most efficient way to learn. So it just depends, right? There's some people who it's like, I'm going to do this. I need to do it alone. I need to do it for these reasons. And you say, good luck, make a list of what you need and see how you do with checking them off. And others who say, look, so here's the set, I want to go there, but I don't know how to do this. So go to a place where they do that really well, learn hard from people who've done it well. So I don't think it's, don't do it if you're young and untried. Do it if you're young and untried. It's, in biotech is different from tech because the amount of money you need to raise to do biotech is big. There are a lot of zeros. It's not make an app in your garage. So the people who are going to write those checks, the saying in the industry is, right, well, who's the adult in the room? Should I, if I'm going to write a check for $150 million, is it, what do you, why would I give it to you? Why wouldn't I give it to a seasoned person? Yeah. And so it depends.
You kind of have to know yourself, like what environment would you succeed in terms, and also how would you learn to like start a company? So.
Right. And you have to be for sure have to be willing to fail.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Failure is like, they say failure is not an option, but just failure is sometimes an option, especially in biotech.
Well, it may or may not be an option, but it's happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and scientists are used to failing, right? If some significant percentage of your experiments aren't.
We call it experimenting, right?
Yeah. That's, otherwise you're not at the edge. You're just cleaning up. I don't worry that. I think scientists sometimes don't get enough credit for their resilience. But if you're a good scientist, you are by nature, I think you've taught yourself how to be resilient. Business people too, the ones who are successful in high risk businesses.
Of course. And then you, at this point, you had left Vertex and you went back to Harvard as part being like teaching at Harvard Business School. And one of the things you had been started to help create was this Blavatnik Fellowship. And a lot of that's to bring people from the business world to get into the biomedical enterprise. So what motivated you to get back into academia and start this kind of impactful fellowship?
So I loved being at Vertex and we were doing some really exciting projects. But one of the things that happened in the sort of 2005 timeframe was the public perception of the pharmaceutical industry really reached a low. We were competing with tobacco companies for the bottom.
Oh, wow.
And in a very kind of naive, altruistic way. I thought, this is not, first of all, it's not accurate. 90% of the people that I've met who are tackling the challenges of making new medicines really have their heart in it. They're, the science is hard. They're committed to it. The business people want to put new medicines and make them available. But the old pharmaceutical business models of boom and bust really also needed change. The pricing structure is based on blockbusters. It's like Hollywood. You make a great movie, then you're set for the next, 10 years. If you don't make a good movie, then nobody's going to hire you. Nobody's going to license your screen, whatever, right? So it's a boom or bust thing. And even as Hollywood has changed its fundamental structure, I felt that the pharmaceutical industry, with this built on this boom and bust cycle, which we still are, kind of really needs new business thinking. What's a new business model for this? How do we do this? How do we fund something that's so capital intensive, so risk prone, and not find yourself in a situation where where you're being accused of ripping people off, because that's on its face. That's what it looks and feels like. So, and on the science side, there's this feeling, the scientists who are working in industry, they're not doing really hard science. Now, also not a truism. So, like I said, in a very naive kind of, I thought it would, I should put my money where my mouth is and go back and work with young people and try to preach a different gospel. And I like teaching, and I like being around young people. They make me think hard. So that's why I did it. I thought I would, and my old department at Harvard, which had been renamed to cell biology then, they were willing to take me in. And then the surprise was Harvard Business School. And it was before the dean, before Nitin, told that they were really thinking at Harvard Business School about a science business initiative. And would I be interested in coming and being part of that? I thought, I don't have an MBA. So, but it seemed like they were interesting people to work with, and it would be fun to build something. So I actually suggested that they share the appointment and make it one appointment. I said, no, we have never done that. So I had one appointment at Harvard Business School and one appointment in FA, Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And it was great. I met amazing students who've gone on to have really interesting careers. And I got to start this fellowship, which is really came out of a course I taught, where you bring scientists and, to make biotech companies, you need science people and business people to talk together and to build something together. And scientists and business people often have very different languages and expectations and value systems. In the first lecture of the course I used to teach, it was always like, I picked some HBS people and some grad students and asked them questions about their values, and just to see what words you put on the board. When people have a chance to get together and work together and learn from each other, you find all kinds of magical stuff happen. The thought behind this was to provide an opportunity, because I also would meet entrepreneurs saying, I can't meet any scientists, right? I've got an idea, here, but how do I meet a scientist? And scientists saying, I've got a great idea here, but I don't know about writing a business plan. I don't know what. So at the risk of making it sound like a dating service, it really was an opportunity to say, okay, let's come together first in this class and then in this fellowship, work on an idea for a business, have to work with people of a different phenotype and see what comes of it. And so, that was the course, and that led into sort of an expanded version for the fellowship. And the fellowship, I think we have 55 or 60 alumni now, and they're doing all kinds of. Some of them have been successful entrepreneurs. Some of them are now pretty high ranking in pharma companies. Some of them are investors. And they've created a community for themselves, and I think that's the part that excites me the most, is that they support each other now.
That's really great. Yeah. I feel like in Boston, there's just so much talented and motivated people, and it's like just creating these programs to bring them together is really the thing we need to do, which is what Blavatnik was able to do.
Circling back, you just mentioned you were actually among the very few women leading at the highest level of biotech during the era. So what's that experience like? For you, any suggestion for the young generation women scientists?
Mentoring is very important, and mentoring is a very high level skill, which is different from just giving people advice. So to mentor someone effectively, you really need to know them well, and I think have worked together. And sometimes faculty student relationship or coworkers or whatever. So and mentoring was super important for me in terms of learning how to function in very, very different areas. And I've had important mentors of different genders who've mentored me in different ways. So I think it's important for young people. You don't need to have a dozen mentors. You need a couple, and you need a couple who will not only help show you the ropes, but will also from time to time hold up a mirror and say, this has got to be better, or, think again about this. So I wish that that there's been considerable progress for women in this industry, but again, it's like so many other issues. There are many female scientists in many companies. It's 50-50. Sometimes it's more women than in the doing science, but climbing the ladder, it thins pretty quickly, like true for any ladder. The isosceles triangle is pretty steep. So I think, again, having mentors who can help you identify what skills to build, being willing to put the time in to build those skills is important. And, I got used to being alone. Right? It's great now because I can sit on a board and there's another woman or two even. And that I think it's better advice for the company, but it's just personally also more fulfilling than sitting in a room with very smart and interesting men. But, so it's easier now, not as easy as I wish it were. We're far away from parity, but, again, if you're committed to accomplishing what you set out for yourself, you do what you have to do to work practically and effectively in the environment that you're in, even as you're trying to change it. But you got to make some choice. How are you going to spend it's a resource allocation problem. You're going to succeed and have an impact on the situation you're in. You're going to try to change the situation. Doing both is great, but how do you think about parsing the energy is an important question. But you got to just, you have to be a little bit fearless. You have to be, a little bit willing to take a chance, have people laugh at you, or whatever. If you have a thin skin, not the business for you.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So you've had this experience with being in leadership in industry and then teaching as well. And also mentoring younger scientists and executives as well. And then a big part of what you've been doing later in your career is government outreach and kind of advising. So most recently, you were on the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology for Joe Biden. So could you tell us a little bit about this experience dealing with the government? And could you tell us a little bit about how receptive the government was at that point when you were part of the committee?
I have never been interested in government work. It was just something I don't think I'm cut out for that. But it was Eric Lander who called and said, he was the new cabinet level science person in the Biden administration, and asked if I would join this group, on which I had participated in an ad hoc way previously. And so when that happened, especially after a very anti-science administration prior to the Biden administration, you don't say, you say, where do I sign? How can I help? Can I help? It's amazing to be asked. It's amazing to be asked. And then followed 4 years of working with the most incredible group of people I've ever worked with. It was 26 of us across science. So there were 2 of us coming out of biotech life sciences, but social sciences, economists, computer people, physicists, and people who'd run big government agencies. So it was an incredible mix of intellect and passion and real commitment to helping the country maintain its competitiveness in certain areas and to establish competitiveness in other areas. It was just really a remarkable experience, and made me aware of a couple important things. One is, as Eric was fond of saying, as a country, we don't particularly have a science policy. China has a science policy.
Yeah.
Should we have a science policy? What would that look like? What would motivate it? How would you keep it aloof, if you will, from political gives and takes?
Mhm.
And should it be aloof from political gives and takes? So that's a kind of question. The other is I learned, aside from learning how deeply committed scientists across this country are to making America competitive and excellent in science, I learned about young people who are really interested in bringing their science to creating different science policy and how science can continue to drive economic return for this country, working in Washington, working in different agencies, NASA, NOAA. I mean, just there's an incredible community of scientists who have very little overlap with places like the Broad or academic science or the biotech industry. And they bring a perspective and an expertise and a prism on the problems that are applicable at a scale that's much larger. Driving federal policy on anything is a whole different challenge, as I coming to appreciate. So, I think young people. I know this is a hard time to be saying this, but I think young people should be considering what the opportunities are in federal agencies. It's not just a matter of being a PI at the NIH. It could be being a reviewer at the FDA. It could be being an epidemiologist at the CDC. There's important work to be done at that level, and it's so important for this country's economic health that our science and innovation base be vibrant.
Yeah, I agree. I think you kind of mentioned growing up with like Sputnik, kind of the interest in science fueled by like the space race. And I think now we saw with pandemic and like how a lot of the work was being done in the US to develop mRNA technology. We could show like, science is great and all, but it's like shows how the US can lead at something and impact the world, not just us. Yeah, so that's good. Hopefully people work in government and also communication as well. I think we like to communicate as scientists, but I think something we got to do better is communicate to the public.
That's
Yes.
absolutely one of the projects we worked on in PCAST was this. We're good at talking to each other. We're not necessarily good at making what science is and how it works and where its vulnerabilities are accessible to a broader public. And if we don't learn how to do that better, we've benefited from a pretty trusting relationship between the general public and scientists and science, but it's fraying for sure. And we need to be much better at communicating what we know, what we think we know, and what we hope to know. And sometimes it's all kind of mushed up in sound bites, and that creates confusion and mistrust and a sense that you guys don't know what you're talking about. Why should I listen to you as opposed to look at my social media feed and get some, I'll go look at a WebMD to find out, what does this mean? So I think accuracy, engagement, really important. You guys need to, this is why things like this, think about scale, think about reaching a broader community, because trust, and not mindless trust, but an understanding of what science can contribute and what it doesn't know, where there is uncertainty, and how people can think about managing that uncertainty is hugely important. So keep podcasting.
Keep podcasting.
Cast a wider net.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was part of the goal. And I think, like you said, make it more visible. Like people see like NASA, what they're doing with rocket launches. We've talked about in interviews. So we got to figure out how to broadcast what we're doing in biotech.
Yeah, I think we can wrap up, right? That's the last question I always out to ask. Like, now it's like really complicated new phase right now. The rise of AI, ongoing trading war, and the new regulations, and always like a big ethic question for biotech, whatever. So as a scientist, CEO, and a policy advisor, so what do you think the next decades of biotech will look like? And the people, especially like our listener, they're younger, but which direction is promising? How to build boldly in that space?
Once again, I have no crystal ball. I do think, and I've said this before, and I think it's true, is we've gone through, on the purely science side, on the purely science and drug discovery side, we've been through a very productive, in some ways, approach to making medicines that's very single reductionist driven, right? Here's a target. It's become almost a religion. Here's a target. Let's make a molecule. Let's make a modality. And that's brought a certain clarity and fit with the technology that we have. But the diseases that are facing us are complicated and multi-system. And so I think asking the question, what's the right balance between this very reductionist approach and a more holistic approach, whatever that might look like, aided by technology now? I think it's a time to step up the game and start asking questions about integrated systems and how we can improve outcomes. I'm also right in the middle of now. I read this book and now I'm listening to it, Peter Attia's book, Outlive, on longevity. And I'm not a big, we can have a long discussion about the relevance of longevity, but I think he makes an interesting point about the importance of prevention and the importance of early detection and the intersection between lifestyle and health. And I think that community and the deeply scientific community often don't have much to say to each other. And I think that needs to change. I think I like seeing a little more porosity as we think about the complexity of the diseases that are facing us. We've tried many times with single target approaches to tackle complex neurodegenerative diseases, cancers as well. They keep coming back. So I think that however we choose to do it, digital technologies, computational technologies, wet technologies, I think tackling these more complicated biological systems with more tools is an important. It's a future for people who can integrate. It's a future for people who are diverse and multilingual with regard to what they can do. So for the next generation, I'm preaching speak more than one language and learn how to speak it well. Learn how to speak them well, but speak more than one language because that's what's going to be required for solving this next round of problems.
And being able to adapt to pick up new languages too. Like with AI, it's something people haven't really focused on, but now that's all the rage.
Right.
Podcasting,
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in the old dog, new tricks, category, but I think for the next generation, that's just really, it's important.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that advice. And before we end the interview, we want to learn a little bit more about people outside of their jobs. So could you share a little bit about Could you share a little bit about your favorite hobbies, what you like to do outside of work?
What do I like? Well, I like to cook, as you pointed out. With a knife in hand, I actually am a ballroom dancer. So I'm a competitive ball dancer.
Which styles do you like to dance?
I dance mostly the international standard style, which is waltz, tango, foxtrot.
Wow.
For which I credit our older daughter. She's a professional competitive dancer and five-time national champion and all that other stuff. But she got me into it because she said, otherwise I don't do anything. I have no athletic skill whatsoever. And otherwise I would just, sit around and be unhealthy. So when she was at university, she got me started with the university ballroom dance group. And so I do that. And I read a lot. And so,
okay.
Yeah.
It's really cool. Picked up hobbies later. And then for our audience who might not know the context, Vicki is very much into cooking, and on her picture of her cast, she's cooking a turkey for Thanksgiving, which is why she has the big knife. But yeah, it was great getting to hear more about your career in biotech and kind of the stuff you've been doing now. And we really appreciate kind of your experience in advising us, because you've been a supporter of our club and acknowledged it to you. Met and remembered us from when we were like a baby organization. So we definitely appreciate your help now that we're a young adult at this point.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to see how this club has gone from somebody's little idea to something very organized and with the potential for a lot of impact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Vicki.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, that's the end of this episode for the Harvard Griffin GSAS Biotech Club's The Pulse podcast. I want to thank Fung for helping co-host and produce this episode, and I want to thank everyone for listening, and please stay tuned for our next episode.